Professor Margaret Chen stood at the front of her classroom, chalk in hand, completely focused on the math problem she was writing on the board. The evening class was going well. Her 23 graduate students sat in their seats, some taking notes, others watching carefully as she explained the complex equations. Outside, the November sky had turned dark hours ago. Inside, the bright fluorescent lights made everything clear and easy to see. Margaret had been teaching advanced calculus at Riverside University for 15 years. She loved her job. She loved the challenge of helping students understand difficult mathematical concepts. She loved the moment when confusion turned to understanding in a student's eyes. Most of all, she loved math itself. To her, math was beautiful, like poetry or music. Tonight's topic was Laplace transforms. This was not easy math. Even her graduate students, who had studied math for many years, found it challenging, but Margaret had a gift for making hard things seem simpler. She broke down complex ideas into smaller pieces. She used examples from real life. She drew diagrams and graphs. She answered every question with patience. "Now, watch carefully," Margaret said to her class. "This is where it gets interesting. We're going to apply the convolution theorem here." She turned back to the blackboard and began writing the next line of the proof. Then, without any warning, everything went dark. The fluorescent lights above, their heads flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The hum of the ventilation system stopped. The glow from the projector screen disappeared. For a moment, the classroom was in total darkness. Someone gasped. Another student laughed nervously. Margaret froze, her chalk still pressed against the blackboard. She had been in the middle of writing an important equation. Now she couldn't see anything at all. After a few seconds, dim emergency lights came on. They were mounted near the floor along the walls. These lights were meant to help people find the exits during emergencies. They gave off a weak yellowish glow that created strange shadows across the room. It was better than complete darkness, but not by much. "Well," Margaret said, trying to sound calm and cheerful, "this is unexpected." Around the room, students pulled out their phones. Small bright screens lit up faces in the darkness. Some students turned on their phone flashlights. The room filled with the glow of mobile devices, creating a strange patchwork of light and shadow. "Professor Chen, are we canceling class?" a student named David asked from the third row. He sounded hopeful. Margaret frowned. She had a policy about canceling classes. She believed that education was important, and she took her responsibility seriously. In 15 years of teaching, she had only canceled class 3 times. Once when she had the flu so badly she couldn't stand up. Once during a massive snowstorm that closed the entire university. And once when her father passed away. A simple power outage wasn't going to make it 4 times. Cancel class? Certainly not, Margaret said firmly. We have chalk. We have a blackboard. We have emergency lighting. We can continue. Several students groaned softly. A few laughed. They knew Professor Chen well enough to expect this answer. Margaret walked carefully to her desk, using her phone's flashlight to see. She had prepared detailed notes for tonight's lecture on her laptop. The laptop's battery was still working, so the screen glowed brightly in the darkness. She had spent 3 hours yesterday preparing a complete proof of an important theorem. It was elegant and beautiful. Each step led logically to the next. She had been excited to share it with her students, but now she faced a problem. The proof was long and complex. It filled several pages of detailed notes on her computer. She couldn't simply project it on the screen anymore because the projector was dead. She couldn't see her laptop screen clearly while writing on the board at the same time, and the proof was too complicated to recreate from memory in these conditions. Margaret squinted at her laptop screen, trying to read her notes by the computer's glow. The emergency lighting was so dim that reading was difficult. She could make out the main ideas, but the details were harder to see. She had already written the first few lines of the proof on the board before the power went out. But there were many more steps to go. Is everyone comfortable continuing in this lighting? Margaret asked her class. If anyone needs to leave because of the darkness, I understand. No one moved. The students had paid good money for this class. They had worked hard to get into this graduate program. A little darkness wasn't going to stop them from learning. Good, Margaret said. She adjusted her reading glasses and leaned closer to her laptop screen, trying to make out the next line of her proof. The truth was, Margaret prided herself on being able to handle any situation. She had taught classes during fire drills, once conducted a review session in a parking lot when all the buildings were being fumigated, and had even held office hours via video call from a hospital waiting room once. A power outage was just another challenge to overcome. She picked up her chalk again and turned to face the blackboard. Using her phone's flashlight, she tried to see where she had left off. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows that made the chalk marks hard to read. She squinted, moved closer, and tried to remember exactly what came next in the proof. Behind her, students shifted in their seats. Papers rustled. Someone whispered to a friend. The unusual situation had made everyone a bit restless and uncertain. Margaret began to write, slowly and carefully. She had to hold her phone in one hand to see the board, and write with the other hand. It was awkward. The light from her phone created harsh shadows that moved every time her hand moved. She wrote one line, then paused to check her notes again, then another line. This was going to take much longer than she had planned. She was so focused on her task that she didn't notice the quiet figure standing near the back door of the classroom. The emergency lighting was too dim to illuminate the back of the room very well, and Margaret's attention was completely fixed on the mathematical problem in front of her. But someone was there, watching silently. Someone who had been in the room when the lights went out. Someone who had every reason to leave but had chosen to stay instead. Someone who was looking at the equations on the blackboard with great interest. This person held a mop in one hand and stood next to a large gray trash bin on wheels. He had been in the middle of his evening cleaning duties when darkness fell. Now he remained still, his eyes fixed on the partial proof written on the board in white chalk. His lips moved slightly as if he was reading the equations to himself. His eyes followed each line of mathematics with complete understanding. Margaret continued to struggle with her notes, unaware that she was being observed. She managed to write another few lines of the proof, but she knew she was making mistakes. The lighting was too poor. Her notes were too detailed to read properly, and the proof required too much precision to recreate under these conditions. She felt frustrated. This wasn't how she had planned for tonight's lesson to go. The person in the back of the room took a small step forward, then stopped. He seemed to be thinking about something, making a decision. His grip tightened slightly on the mop handle. His eyes moved from the board to the professor, then back to the board again. Margaret put down her chalk and sighed. She turned to face her students, shielding her eyes from the glare of their phone lights. "I apologize," she said. "This is more difficult than I expected. Perhaps we should—" "Excuse me, Professor Chen." The voice came from the back of the room. It was quiet, polite, and uncertain. Margaret turned toward the sound, surprised. She hadn't realized anyone was standing back there. Margaret squinted toward the back of the classroom, trying to see who had spoken. Several students turned in their seats, pointing their phone lights toward the back door. The beams of light caught a figure standing in the shadows. It was Marcus Williams, the evening janitor. Margaret recognized him immediately, though she realized with some embarrassment that she had never actually learned his name. She had seen him many times over the years, of course. He was the man who emptied the trash bins in her classroom. The man who mopped the floors after her evening classes ended. The man who cleaned the blackboards and made sure the room was ready for the next day. Marcus stood beside his cleaning cart, looking uncomfortable in the sudden attention. He was a tall man, maybe close to 60 years old, with gray hair cut very short and deep lines around his eyes. His dark blue janitor's uniform was clean but worn. His hands, rough and weathered from years of physical work, gripped the handle of his mop. In all the years Marcus had worked at Riverside University, very few people really saw him. Students passed by him in hallways without a glance. Professors might nod politely but rarely spoke to him beyond a brief hello or good evening. He was part of the background of university life, noticed only when trash bins were full or floors needed cleaning. Marcus had been emptying the trash bins in Margaret's classroom when the power went out. He had been about to move to the next room when darkness fell. Most people in his position would have simply left. His job didn't require him to stay in classrooms during lessons. He could come back later to finish cleaning. But Marcus hadn't left. Instead, he had stayed, standing quietly in the back, watching. "Yes?" Margaret said, shading her eyes from the phone lights. "Can I help you with something?" Marcus took a small step forward, then hesitated. He looked nervous. His eyes moved from Margaret to the students, then to the floor. He seemed to be gathering courage. "I'm sorry to interrupt your class," Marcus said quietly. His voice was deep but gentle. I was here when the lights went out. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "You're not disturbing us," Margaret assured him. "Did you need to finish cleaning?" "We can work around you." "No, ma'am. That's not it." Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I was watching. I couldn't help but notice what you were writing on the board." Margaret felt confused. Why would a janitor care about mathematical equations? Maybe he needed to clean the blackboard. But that didn't make sense. She always erased her own boards at the end of class. Several students had turned back around, no longer interested in the janitor. They assumed he just needed to do his job. But a few students kept watching, curious about this interruption. Marcus looked at the blackboard, his eyes following the lines of chalk. The emergency lighting was dim, but he seemed to have no trouble reading what was written there. "You're working on Laplace transforms," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Margaret's confusion deepened. "Yes," she said slowly. "I am." "How did you—" She stopped, not sure what to ask. How did a janitor know what Laplace transforms were? "And that proof you're writing," Marcus continued, his voice growing slightly stronger. "You're trying to demonstrate the convolution theorem, aren't you?" The classroom went very quiet. Even the students who had turned away were now paying attention again. Several of them exchanged puzzled glances. Margaret felt her heart beat faster. The convolution theorem was not basic mathematics. It was an advanced concept that even her graduate students found challenging. How could this janitor possibly know what she was doing? That's correct," Margaret said. She studied Marcus more carefully now, seeing him with new eyes. "How do you know about convolution theorems?" Marcus looked down at his hands, still gripping the mop. He seemed embarrassed, as if he had said something he shouldn't have. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The only sound was the faint buzz of phone screens and someone's nervous cough. Finally, Marcus looked up again. "I studied mathematics," he said simply. "A long time ago." "You studied mathematics?" Margaret repeated. She heard the surprise in her own voice and felt bad about it. Why shouldn't a janitor have studied mathematics? But at the same time, she couldn't help her curiosity. If he had studied advanced math, how had he ended up working as a janitor? "Yes, ma'am. At MIT. Back in the 90s. Marcus said this quietly, as if he wasn't proud of it, but rather stating a simple fact. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the best universities in the world for mathematics and science. Margaret taught at a good university, but MIT was in a different league entirely. She stared at Marcus, trying to process this information. A student named Jennifer, who always sat in the front row, raised her hand. "You went to MIT?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. Marcus nodded. "Yes, I was in the PhD program, but I didn't finish." He said this last part quickly, as if wanting to get past it. Margaret's mind was racing. A PhD program at MIT. That meant Marcus had completed a bachelor's degree, probably a master's degree too, and had been working on his doctorate. That meant years of advanced study. That meant he had been serious about mathematics, not just taking a few classes. "What happened?" Margaret asked gently. "Why didn't you finish?" Marcus looked uncomfortable again. These were clearly personal questions, and he was being asked them in front of a room full of strangers. But he had opened this door himself by speaking up. He seemed to understand that some explanation was necessary. "Life happened," Marcus said with a sad smile. "My wife got sick, very sick. I had to leave school to take care of her. And then there were medical bills, lots of them. I needed a job that had good health insurance and steady pay. So I took a position at a hospital as a janitor. When my wife passed away a few years later, I kept doing the same kind of work. I moved here to be closer to my daughter. The university had an opening and I took it. The room was completely silent now. Every student was listening. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked shocked. Jennifer had tears in her eyes. Even in the dim emergency lighting, Margaret could see that this man's simple explanation held years of sacrifice and pain. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said softly. She meant it. She tried to imagine leaving her career to care for a sick spouse, giving up everything she had worked for and then just never going back. It seemed unbearably sad. "Thank you," Marcus said, "but that was a long time ago. 20 years now." "I'm okay, but was he okay?" Margaret wondered. Here was a man who had been trained at one of the world's best universities, who clearly had a brilliant mind, and he spent his days mopping floors and emptying trash. That couldn't be the life he had imagined for himself. Do you still do mathematics?" Margaret asked. "For yourself?" For the first time, Marcus's face changed. A small smile appeared. "Yes," he said. "In my free time, I work on problems. I read papers online. Sometimes, after everyone goes home, I use the empty classrooms to write out proofs on the blackboards, just to keep my mind sharp." Margaret felt a strange mixture of emotions. Sadness that this talented man had lost his chance at an academic career, respect for his dedication to keep learning despite everything, and shame that she had walked past him hundreds of times over the years without ever really seeing him. "That's remarkable," she said. "It's wonderful that you've kept up with it." Marcus shrugged. "It's just something I enjoy. Mathematics is, well, it's like a friend that never left me even when everything else changed." One of the students, a young man named Carlos, spoke up. "So you can understand the stuff we're learning in this class?" Marcus glanced at the blackboard again. "Yes," he said simply. "I can understand it." "That's so cool," Carlos said, sounding genuinely impressed. Margaret found herself smiling. This strange conversation in the darkness of a power outage had revealed something unexpected and wonderful. But they still had a problem to solve. She was still stuck in the middle of a proof, unable to see her notes clearly, struggling to continue her lesson. An idea came to her. It was unusual, maybe even inappropriate. But why not? They were already in an unusual situation. "Marcus," Margaret said, "you said you were watching what I was writing. Do you remember the convolution theorem proof?" Marcus looked at her carefully as if trying to understand what she was really asking. "Yes," he said. "I know it pretty well." Margaret made a decision. "Can you help me?" she asked. "I'm having trouble reading my notes in this lighting, and this proof is quite long. If you remember it, could you help me write it on the board?" The classroom erupted in whispers. Students turned to each other, surprised by this development. A janitor helping the professor teach the class? This was definitely not normal. Marcus looked uncertain. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I don't want to overstep. This is your classroom." "I'm absolutely sure," Margaret said firmly. She meant it. Pride had no place here. Her students needed to learn this material, and if Marcus could help them learn it, then she wanted his help. "Please, I would appreciate it very much." Marcus looked at the blackboard, then at the students, then back at Margaret. Slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "If you really want me to, I'll help." Marcus set his mop carefully against the wall. He pushed his cleaning cart to the side of the room where it wouldn't be in anyone's way. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he was giving himself time to think about what he had just agreed to do. Margaret watched him, feeling both excited and nervous. She had just asked a janitor to help her teach a graduate-level mathematics class. This was not in any university handbook. She had no idea if this was even allowed, but somehow it felt right. They were all just people trying to learn and share knowledge. Why should it matter what job title someone had? Some of the students were whispering to each other. Margaret caught fragments of their conversations. Is this really happening? A janitor who went to MIT? This is so weird. I think it's kind of cool, actually. Jennifer, the student in the front row, raised her hand again. Professor Chen, are we really going to learn from the janitor? Margaret heard the doubt in Jennifer's voice. She understood it. Jennifer had worked hard to get into this graduate program. She had studied for years. She was paying thousands of dollars in tuition. Now she was being asked to accept help from a man who cleaned toilets for a living. It wasn't what anyone expected from an elite education. Jennifer, Margaret said firmly, we're going to learn from someone who studied at MIT and clearly understands this material. The fact that he works as a janitor doesn't change what he knows. Knowledge is knowledge, no matter who possesses it. Jennifer looked embarrassed. I didn't mean it like that, she said quickly. I was just surprised. I know, Margaret said more gently. We're all surprised. But let's keep an open mind, shall we? Marcus had reached the front of the classroom now. Up close, in the better lighting near the emergency lights by the door, Margaret could see his face more clearly. He looked nervous but also determined. His eyes, she noticed, were sharp and intelligent. They were the eyes of someone who thought deeply about things. "Where should I start?" Marcus asked. His voice was quiet, respectful. He clearly didn't want to take over. He was offering to help, not to replace her. Margaret gestured to the blackboard. "I've written the first few lines here. We're proving that the Laplace transform of a convolution equals the product of the Laplace transforms. I was trying to continue with the integral definition, but I'm having trouble seeing my notes clearly enough." Marcus stepped closer to the blackboard. He studied what Margaret had written, his head tilted slightly to one side. His lips moved silently as he read through the equations. After a moment, he nodded. "I see what you're doing," he said. "This is a good start, may I?" He gestured toward the box of chalk sitting on the ledge below the blackboard. "Please," Margaret said, stepping aside to give him room. Marcus picked up a piece of white chalk. He held it in his right hand, his grip firm and comfortable. It was clear he had held chalk many times before. He stood facing the blackboard for a moment, thinking. Then he began to write. The classroom went completely silent. Every student leaned forward to watch. Phone lights focused on the blackboard, creating a pool of light where Marcus was working. His handwriting was neat and clear. Each number and symbol was carefully formed. He didn't rush. He wrote one line, paused to think, then wrote the next line. His movements were confident. There was no hesitation, no erasing and rewriting. He knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret watched in amazement. She had taught this proof many times over the years. She knew it well, but watching Marcus write it out, she noticed things she had never seen before. He took a slightly different approach than she usually did. His method was more elegant, more streamlined. He skipped some of the intermediate steps that she always included, not because he was being sloppy, but because he understood the material so deeply that those steps were obvious to him. "Wait," said David, the student who had asked earlier if class was canceled. "Can you explain that last step? I don't see how you got from this line to that one." Marcus stopped writing. He turned to face the class, chalk still in hand. For a moment he looked uncertain again, as if he had forgotten that he wasn't just solving a problem for himself. He was teaching. "Oh, sorry," Marcus said. "I should have explained. Let me show you." He turned back to the board and wrote out the intermediate steps, talking as he wrote. "If we expand this integral here, and then apply the substitution that we defined earlier, we can simplify it like this." "Does that make sense?" David nodded slowly. "Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense now. Thanks." "You're welcome," Marcus said with a small smile. Margaret felt a warm feeling in her chest. Marcus wasn't just knowledgeable. He could teach. He could explain complex ideas in ways that students could understand. That was a rare gift and not something that every brilliant mathematician possessed. Marcus continued writing. The proof was taking shape on the blackboard, line by line, equation by equation. Students were taking notes now, their pens moving across paper, trying to keep up. Another student raised her hand. Her name was Rachel, and she was one of the best students in the class. "Excuse me," she said. "I have a question about the boundary conditions. Why are we assuming they vanish at infinity?" Marcus paused. He turned to Rachel with interest. "That's an excellent question," he said. "We're assuming that because we're dealing with functions that represent real physical systems in most applications. In the real world, signals don't go on forever with the same intensity. They fade out. But you're right to question that assumption. In pure mathematics, we would need to be more careful about stating our conditions." Rachel looked pleased. She wrote something in her notebook. Margaret was impressed. Marcus had not only answered the question, he had praised Rachel for asking it. He had acknowledged that her thinking was correct. That was good teaching. That was what Margaret tried to do with her own students. Encourage them to question, to think critically, to not just accept things blindly. Carlos, the student who had said it was cool that Marcus understood the material, raised his hand next. "How did you learn all this? I mean, it's been 20 years since you were in school, right? How do you remember it all?" Marcus set down his chalk and turned to face the class fully. "I never stopped learning," he said simply. "After I left MIT, I thought I would go back someday. I thought maybe when things got better I could finish my degree. So I kept studying. I read textbooks. I followed online courses. I worked through problem sets. And then, even after I accepted that I probably wouldn't go back to school, I kept studying anyway, because I loved it. But why? Carlos asked. I mean, if you knew you weren't going to use it for a career, why keep studying such hard stuff? Marcus thought about this for a moment. Have you ever done something just because it made you happy? He asked Carlos. Not because you had to, not because someone was paying you, but just because you loved doing it. Carlos nodded. Yeah, I play guitar. I'm not very good, and I'll never be in a band or anything, but I love playing. Exactly, Marcus said. That's how I feel about mathematics. It makes me happy. When I'm working on a difficult problem, I forget about everything else. I forget about my tired feet from standing all day. I forget about getting older. I forget about all the things I didn't get to do with my life. There's just me and the math, and for those moments, everything feels right. The room was quiet. Several students nodded in understanding. They had all chosen to study advanced mathematics. They understood that love of learning, that drive to solve difficult problems just for the satisfaction of solving them. Jennifer spoke up again, but this time her voice was different. Softer. More respectful. I'm sorry for what I said earlier, she told Marcus. About learning from the janitor. That was rude. It's okay, Marcus said kindly. I understand. It's unusual. You came here to learn from Professor Chen, not from the guy who empties your trash. I get it. But knowledge is knowledge, Jennifer said, echoing what Margaret had said earlier. And you really know this stuff. I can tell. Thank you, Marcus said. He looked touched by her apology. Margaret decided it was time to move things forward. Marcus, can you continue? I think we're all learning a lot from your approach. Marcus nodded. He turned back to the blackboard and picked up his chalk again. As he continued writing, Margaret noticed something. The atmosphere in the room had changed. At first, students had been skeptical, curious, maybe even slightly dismissive. But now they were genuinely engaged. They were asking real questions. They were taking notes carefully. They were learning, and Marcus, for his part, seemed to be transforming before their eyes. When he had first spoken from the back of the room, he had been hesitant and uncertain. But now, as he taught, he stood taller. His voice was stronger. His movements were more confident. This was what he had been meant to do, Margaret realized. This was who he really was underneath the janitor's uniform. As Marcus wrote out another line of the proof, he made a small sound. He said softly. What is it? Margaret asked. Marcus pointed to something Margaret had written before the power went out. I think there might be a small error here, he said carefully. In this coefficient, should this be a 2 or a 3? Margaret came closer to look. She squinted at the board, then checked her mental calculations. Marcus was right. She had written a 2 when it should have been a 3. It was a minor mistake, one that wouldn't have invalidated the entire proof, but it would have caused confusion later on. You're absolutely right, Margaret said. Good catch. Thank you. She felt no embarrassment about being corrected. Mistakes happened, especially when teaching complex material in poor lighting. What mattered was getting the mathematics right. Marcus erased the 2 and wrote a 3 in its place. Then he continued with the proof. David raised his hand again. Can I ask you something personal? Marcus looked at him. Sure. Do you ever regret it? Leaving MIT, I mean. Giving up your career. The question hung in the air. It was bold, maybe too bold, but everyone wanted to know the answer. Even Margaret was curious. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He set down his chalk and looked at his hands. Those hands that could write elegant mathematical proofs and also push a mop for hours every day. Every single day, Marcus finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. Every single day I think about what might have been. But I also think about my wife and how I got to spend her last years with her instead of being busy at some university. I think about my daughter, and how I was there for her when she needed me. And I think about how even though my life didn't turn out the way I planned, I'm still here. I'm still learning. I'm still surrounded by knowledge and ideas and young people who are excited about learning. So yes, I have regrets, but I also have things to be grateful for. Several students were wiping their eyes now. Even tough-looking Carlos seemed emotional. Margaret herself felt her throat tighten. Marcus picked up the chalk again and turned back to the blackboard. His hand moved steadily across the dark surface. white chalk leaving clear marks in the dim emergency lighting. The proof was growing longer now, filling the board from top to bottom. Each line followed logically from the one before it. Each step was clear and correct. Margaret stood to the side, watching in amazement. She had taught mathematics for 15 years. She had worked with brilliant professors and talented graduate students. She had attended conferences where the smartest mathematicians in the world presented their work. But there was something special about what was happening right now, in this darkened classroom, with a janitor teaching a lesson he had never prepared. What impressed Margaret most was not just that Marcus knew the material. What impressed her was how deeply he understood it. There was a difference between memorizing steps and truly grasping the underlying concepts. Marcus clearly had that deeper understanding. He saw the connections between ideas. He anticipated questions before students asked them. He knew which parts would be difficult and took extra time to explain them. "Now watch this part carefully," Marcus said to the class. "This is where a lot of people get confused. We're going to integrate by parts here, and it's going to look messy at first. But trust the process. It will simplify beautifully." He wrote out the integration step by step. Just as he had predicted, the middle section looked complicated and difficult. Students frowned at their notes, trying to follow along. But Marcus kept going, and gradually the complexity began to dissolve. Terms canceled out, factors simplified, and suddenly the result was elegant and clean. "See?" Marcus said, tapping the final simplified expression with his chalk. "Mathematics has this wonderful way of rewarding patience. Sometimes you have to work through the mess to get to the beauty on the other side." Rachel raised her hand. "That was amazing. How did you know it would simplify like that?" Marcus smiled. "Experience," he said, "and pattern recognition. When you've worked with these types of integrals enough times, you start to see the patterns. You develop an intuition for what's going to work." "Can you teach us that intuition?" Rachel asked eagerly. "That's what we're doing right now," Marcus said. "Intuition comes from practice and exposure. The more problems you solve, the more patterns you'll recognize. There's no shortcut, but there is a path." Margaret made a mental note. That was exactly the kind of insight she tried to share with her students. But hearing it from someone like Marcus, someone who had kept his skills sharp through 20 years of self-study, made it even more powerful. Marcus was living proof that dedication and love of learning could sustain you through anything. Marcus continued writing, filling the blackboard with mathematics. His chalk moved quickly but neatly. He never had to stop and think about what came next. The proof flowed from his mind to the board as naturally as water flowing downhill. Jennifer, who had apologized earlier for her dismissive comment, was now taking notes faster than anyone else in the class. She kept looking up at the board, then down at her paper, then back up again, trying not to miss anything. "Mr. Williams," she said, "can you slow down just a little? I want to make sure I get all of this." Marcus stopped immediately. "Of course. I'm sorry. I was going too fast, wasn't I?" He waited patiently while Jennifer caught up with her notes. Margaret noticed that he had called Jennifer by name, even though she had never introduced herself. Marcus must have heard her name during class discussions. That meant he had been paying attention to these classes for longer than just tonight. How many times had he stood quietly in the back of rooms, listening to lectures while he cleaned? How many blackboards full of mathematics had he read while everyone else assumed he was just doing his janitorial duties? When Jennifer nodded that she was ready, Marcus continued. He was working on the final section of the proof now, bringing all the pieces together to reach the conclusion. This was the part that Margaret always found most satisfying to teach. This was where all the hard work paid off, where the theorem revealed itself in its full truth. "We're almost there," Marcus said to the class. "Just a few more steps. Stay with me," he wrote out the next line, then the next. The conclusion was approaching. Students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something important was about to happen. And then, with a final flourish, Marcus wrote the conclusion. The Laplace transform of a convolution equals the product of the Laplace transforms. The proof was complete. For a moment, nobody moved. The classroom was silent except for the faint hum of emergency lighting. Everyone stared at the blackboard, at the complete proof written out in Marcus's neat handwriting. Then someone started clapping. It was Carlos. He stood up from his seat and applauded, smiling broadly. Within seconds, other students joined in, then more. Soon the entire class was on their feet, clapping and cheering. Some students whistled. Others called out "Bravo!" and "That was incredible." Marcus stood at the front of the room, chalk still in his hand, looking completely stunned. His eyes were wide. His mouth hung slightly open. He clearly had not expected this reaction. A blush crept up his neck and colored his face. He looked down at his feet, embarrassed but also pleased. Margaret found herself clapping too, tears in her eyes. This was one of the most remarkable things she had ever witnessed in a classroom. Not just the mathematics, though, that had been excellent, but the way this man, who had every reason to be bitter about his life, had shared his knowledge with such generosity and patience. The way he had stepped out of the shadows, literally and figuratively, to help others learn. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, barely audible over the applause. "Thank you very much. But really, I was just helping out." "You were doing more than helping out," David called from his seat. "You were teaching. And you're really good at it." More students voiced their agreement. The applause continued for a full minute before gradually dying down. Students returned to their seats, but the energy in the room remained high. Everyone was talking excitedly, discussing what they had just seen. Margaret walked up to Marcus and shook his hand. "That was extraordinary," she said warmly. "Truly extraordinary. Thank you for sharing your gift with us." Marcus's hand was rough and calloused from years of manual labor, but his handshake was firm and warm. "Thank you for letting me," he said. "I haven't done anything like that in 20 years. I forgot how good it feels." "How good what feels?" Margaret asked. "Teaching?" "Teaching, yes. But more than that. Connecting with people through ideas. Sharing something you love and seeing others start to love it too. I miss that more than I realized." A thought occurred to Margaret. "Marcus, did you ever teach when you were at MIT?" "Were you a teaching assistant?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, for 3 semesters. I taught calculus to undergraduates. It was my favorite part of graduate school, actually. I loved the research, but I loved teaching even more." Margaret felt her heart sink. Here was a man who loved teaching, who was clearly talented at it, and he had spent 20 years emptying trash bins instead. It seemed like such a terrible waste. Not that there was anything wrong with being a janitor. It was honest, necessary work. But Marcus had so much more to offer. Rachel approached the front of the room holding her notebook. "Mr. Williams, can I ask you to explain one more time how you did the substitution in the middle section? I got a little lost there." "Of course," Marcus said. He turned back to the board and walked Rachel through the steps again, taking his time, making sure she understood. His patience was remarkable. He never acted like any question was stupid or obvious. He treated every student with respect and kindness. While Marcus was helping Rachel, other students came forward with their own questions. Soon there was a small crowd gathered around him, all asking about different parts of the proof. Marcus answered each question thoughtfully, sometimes writing additional examples on the board to help explain his points. Margaret watched this scene with growing conviction. Something had to change. This situation could not continue. Marcus could not go back to being invisible, to cleaning floors and emptying trash while his brilliant mind was ignored. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. And it wasn't what was best for the students either. They deserved teachers like Marcus. She pulled out her phone and stepped to the side of the room where she could think clearly. An idea was forming in her mind. It was bold. It might be complicated, but she had to try. As the students continued to ask Marcus questions, Margaret noticed something else. Marcus's entire demeanor had changed. When he had first entered the classroom, he had looked tired. His shoulders had been slumped.
He had moved slowly, like someone much older than his years.
But now, after teaching for almost an hour, he looked younger. He stood straight. His eyes were bright and alert. His voice was strong and confident. Teaching had brought him back to life. Jennifer approached Margaret. "Professor Chen," she said, "this has been the most amazing class I've ever attended. I learned so much tonight. Not just about math, but about not judging people by their appearances or their jobs. I'm glad," Margaret said sincerely. "We all learned that lesson tonight." "Is Mr. Williams going to teach more classes?" Jennifer asked hopefully. "I don't know," Margaret said, "but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure his talents don't stay hidden anymore." Finally, after all the questions had been answered, the students began to pack up their belongings. They moved slowly, reluctant to leave. Several students went up to Marcus to thank him personally. Some asked if they could contact him if they had questions about other topics. Marcus gave them his email address, looking touched by their interest. As students filed out of the classroom, they passed by Marcus's cleaning cart still sitting at the side of the room. The contrast was jarring. Here was this brilliant mathematician, and in a few minutes he would go back to mopping floors and emptying trash bins. The students seemed to notice this too. Their expressions were thoughtful, troubled even. When the last student had left, only Margaret and Marcus remained in the dim classroom. The emergency lighting cast long shadows across the floor. The blackboard was covered with chalk marks, a record of an extraordinary hour. "Marcus," Margaret said, "can you stay for a few minutes? I'd like to talk to you about something important." Marcus looked at his watch. "I still have 3 more floors to clean tonight," he said. "But yes, I can spare a few minutes." They sat down in the front row of seats. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. What she was about to suggest would require approval from the department head, maybe even the dean. It might not work, but she had to try. "What happened tonight shouldn't be a one-time thing," Margaret began. Marcus looked at Margaret with a mixture of hope and caution in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. "I mean that what you did tonight was remarkable. Your knowledge, your teaching ability, your passion for mathematics, those are rare gifts. They shouldn't be wasted." Margaret leaned forward in her seat, speaking earnestly. "I want to help you find a way to use those gifts again." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Professor Chen, I appreciate what you're saying. I really do. But I'm almost 60 years old. I don't have a PhD. I've been out of academia for 20 years. Who's going to hire me to teach?" "We are," Margaret said firmly. "Or at least I'm going to try to make that happen. I want to talk to the department head about creating a position for you." "A position for a janitor," Marcus said with a sad smile. "I don't think that's how universities work." "Not as a janitor," Margaret said. "As a teacher, or at least as a teaching assistant while you finish your degree." Marcus stared at her. "Finish my degree? I can't afford to go back to school." "Do you know how much graduate programs cost?" "Many universities offer tuition support for their teaching assistants," Margaret explained. "Riverside might be able to do the same. I don't know all the details yet, but I want to explore the possibilities. Will you let me try?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his hands. Those weathered hands that had scrubbed floors and cleaned windows for so many years. When he looked up again, there were tears in his eyes. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." "Because it's the right thing to do," Margaret said simply, "and because education should be about recognizing and developing talent wherever it's found." "You have extraordinary talent, Marcus. It would be wrong for me to ignore that." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He took a shaky breath. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Can I tell you what it was really like giving up on MIT? Because I've never told anyone the whole story." "Of course," Margaret said gently. "I'm listening." Marcus settled back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling as if he was looking back through time. "I was in my 3rd year of the PhD program," he began. "I was working on my dissertation. It was about chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics. I was so excited about it. My advisor said it was brilliant work. I was on track to finish in another year, maybe 2 at most." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Margaret waited patiently. "Then my wife, Sarah, started feeling tired all the time. At first we thought it was just stress. She was working full-time while I was in school. But it got worse. She started losing weight, having pain. We finally went to the doctor, and that's when we found out she had cancer, lymphoma." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She could hear the pain in Marcus's voice even after all these years. "The treatments were aggressive," Marcus continued. "Chemotherapy, radiation, eventually a bone marrow transplant. She was so sick. And our daughter Amy, she was only 8 years old. She was terrified. She didn't understand why her mother was sick, why her hair fell out, why she was in the hospital so much." Marcus's voice grew quieter. "I tried to keep going with my studies at first. My advisor was understanding. He gave me extensions on deadlines, but I couldn't focus. How could I think about mathematical equations when my wife was fighting for her life? When my daughter needed me? So I took a leave of absence," Marcus said. "I thought it would be temporary. I thought Sarah would get better and I could go back. But the medical bills started piling up. Even with insurance, we owed so much money. Cancer treatment is expensive. Incredibly expensive." He looked at Margaret directly now. "I needed a job that paid right away and had good health insurance. I couldn't wait to finish my degree and then look for academic positions. That process takes months, sometimes years. So I took a job as a janitor at the hospital, where Sarah was being treated. The pay wasn't great, but the health insurance was excellent. And I could be close to Sarah during her treatments. Margaret felt tears running down her own face now. She didn't try to hide them. Sarah fought for 3 years, Marcus said. 3 long, hard years. And I was there for all of it. I held her hand during chemo. I slept in a chair next to her hospital bed. I helped her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk alone. I read to her when she couldn't sleep. And I took care of Amy, trying to give her as normal a childhood as possible under the circumstances. In the end, Sarah died anyway, Marcus said, his voice breaking. All that fighting, all that suffering, and we still lost her. Amy was 11 years old when her mother died. 11 years old. The classroom was silent except for the faint buzz of the emergency lights. Margaret reached out and squeezed Marcus's hand. He squeezed back, grateful for the comfort. After Sarah died, I was lost, Marcus continued after a moment. I was grieving. Amy was grieving. We moved to this city to be closer to Sarah's parents so they could help with Amy. I got the janitor job here at the university. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would go back to school someday. But years passed. Amy grew up. She went to college, then graduate school. She became an engineer like she always wanted. And I was so proud of her. But I never went back, Marcus said. At first it was because I was busy raising Amy alone. Then it was because I felt too old, too far removed from academia. Who starts a PhD program at 50? At 55? It seemed impossible. So I just stayed a janitor. And I tried to be okay with that. But you weren't okay with it, Margaret said softly. No, Marcus admitted. I wasn't. I'm still not. Every day I walk through these hallways past classrooms where brilliant professors teach brilliant students, and I feel like a ghost. Like I'm haunting the life I should have had. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sadness of Marcus's story, but she also felt determined. It's not too late, she said firmly. Marcus, listen to me. It is not too late. You're only 59. You could easily work for another 10 or 15 years. You could finish your PhD. You could teach. You could do research. You could have the career you were meant to have. Marcus looked at her with skepticism. You really think that's possible? I know it won't be easy, Margaret said. There will be bureaucracy to deal with. Forms to fill out. Approvals to get. But yes, I think it's possible. And I'm going to fight for it. If you're willing, why are you doing this? Marcus asked again. Really? Why do you care so much? Margaret thought about this. Why did she care? She barely knew this man. She could just thank him for helping with the class and let him go back to his cleaning duties. Nobody would blame her. It wasn't her responsibility to fix his life, but that wasn't who Margaret was. She had become a teacher because she believed in the power of education to transform lives. She believed that everyone deserved a chance to reach their potential, and she believed that talent and intelligence were valuable, no matter what form they came in or where they were found. I care because I'm a teacher, Margaret said finally. And a teacher's job isn't just to instruct the students who show up in class. It's to recognize and nurture potential wherever we find it. Tonight I found extraordinary potential in you. If I ignore that, if I let you go back to being invisible, then I'm failing as a teacher. I'm failing as a human being. Marcus's eyes filled with tears again. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me try, Margaret urged. Say you'll meet with me and the department head. Say you'll fill out applications if we can find a way to make this work. Say you'll give yourself another chance. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Margaret could almost see the battle happening inside him. Hope fighting against fear, possibility wrestling with doubt. She understood. He had given up on his dreams 20 years ago. Opening himself up to hoping again was terrifying. Finally, Marcus nodded. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, I'll let you try. I'll meet with your department head. I'll fill out whatever forms you need. But Professor Chen, I need you to understand something. What? Margaret asked. If this doesn't work out, if we try and it's not possible, I'll be okay. I've learned to live with disappointment. I've learned to find meaning in simple things. But if we try and it does work out, Marcus's voice caught. If it actually happens, if I get a chance to be a mathematician again, to teach again, I don't know if I can handle how much that will mean to me. Do you understand? I'm scared of how much I want this. Margaret felt her heart break a little. She understood completely. When you've lost something precious and learned to live without it, the possibility of getting it back is both wonderful and terrifying. I understand, she said, and I promise you, whether this works out or not, you won't be alone in it. You have a friend now. You have someone who sees you and values you. That won't change. Marcus smiled through his tears. Thank you, he said. Thank you so much. They sat together in the dim classroom for a few more minutes, not talking, just being present with each other. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed shut. But in that small space, something important had shifted. A connection had been made. A possibility had been born. Finally, Marcus stood up. I should get back to work, he said. I still have those 3 floors to clean. Of course, Margaret said, standing as well. But Marcus, one more thing. Can you give me your phone number and email? I want to set up a meeting with the department head as soon as possible. Marcus recited his information, and Margaret entered it into her phone. Then Marcus walked over to his cleaning cart and picked up his mop. For a moment, he just stood there looking at it. You know what's funny? He said. I've pushed this cart through these hallways for 20 years. I know every scratch on it, every squeaky wheel. It's been like a companion in a weird way. But right now, for the first time, I feel like maybe I won't be pushing it forever. Maybe there's something else ahead. There is, Margaret said with conviction. I promise you, Marcus, there is something else ahead. Margaret didn't waste any time. The next morning, even before her first cup of coffee, she sat down at her computer and wrote a detailed email to Dr. Robert Harrison, the head of the mathematics department. She described what had happened during the power outage. She explained Marcus's background, his knowledge, and his teaching ability. She made a passionate case for why the university should find a way to bring him into an academic role. Then she waited, and worried. What if Dr. Harrison thought she was being ridiculous? What if there were rules and regulations that made her idea impossible? What if she had given Marcus false hope? Dr. Harrison's reply came 3 hours later. This is highly unusual, he wrote, but also potentially very interesting. Can you bring Mr. Williams to my office tomorrow at 2? I'd like to meet him. Margaret felt a surge of relief and excitement. She immediately called Marcus. He sounded nervous when he answered the phone. Professor Chen, is everything okay? Everything is more than okay, Margaret said. The department head wants to meet you. Tomorrow at 2. Can you make it? There was a long pause. Then Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly. Yes, I can make it. I'll take time off from work. Don't be nervous, Margaret said, though she knew he would be anyway. Just be yourself. Show him the same knowledge and passion you showed my students. The next day, Margaret met Marcus outside Dr. Harrison's office. Marcus was wearing his nicest clothes, a button-down shirt and clean pants, not his janitor's uniform. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes, like he wasn't used to dressing this way anymore. His hands were shaking slightly. It's going to be fine, Margaret assured him. Dr. Harrison is a good man. Just be honest with him. Dr. Harrison was in his mid-60s with white hair and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had been a professor at Riverside for 30 years and department head for the last 7. He was known for being tough but fair, traditional but open to new ideas. He shook Marcus's hand warmly and gestured for both of them to sit down. Mr. Williams, he began, Professor Chen has told me some remarkable things about you. I'd like to hear your story directly from you. Marcus took a deep breath and began to talk. He told Dr. Harrison about MIT, about his wife's illness, about leaving school to care for his family. He talked about his 20 years as a janitor, about studying mathematics in his spare time, about his love of learning that had never died. He spoke quietly but clearly, not asking for pity, just stating the facts of his life. Dr. Harrison listened carefully, occasionally asking questions. He wanted to know what Marcus had been reading lately, what areas of mathematics interested him most, whether he had kept up with recent developments in the field. Marcus answered each question thoughtfully and in detail. It became clear that he hadn't just maintained his old knowledge, he had continued to grow and learn. He knew about recent papers and current debates in mathematical circles. He had taught himself new areas of math that hadn't even existed when he was at MIT. Impressive, Dr. Harrison said. Very impressive. But I need to be honest with you, Mr. Williams. What Professor Chen is suggesting, Bringing you on as a teaching assistant and supporting you to finish your doctorate is complicated. You don't have a completed master's degree. You've been out of formal academia for 2 decades, and you're asking us to invest considerable resources in someone who would only be able to work for, 10 or 15 years before retirement? Marcus's face fell. Margaret felt her heart sink. This was exactly what she had feared, that the practicalities would make her dream impossible. However, Dr. Harrison continued, and both Marcus and Margaret looked up hopefully. I didn't say it was impossible, just complicated. Let me ask you something, Mr. Williams. If we could make this work, how committed would you be? Would you be willing to work incredibly hard, to prove yourself every single day, to show that we made the right decision in taking a chance on you? Yes, Marcus said immediately, his voice strong. Absolutely yes. Dr. Harrison, if you give me this opportunity, I will work harder than any student you've ever had. I will be the first one in the building every morning, and the last one to leave. I will teach any class you need me to teach. I will do whatever is necessary. This would be a second chance at the life I was meant to live. I won't waste it. Dr. Harrison studied Marcus's face for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I believe you, he said. And I'm going to try to make this happen. But I need you to understand that it won't be immediate. I have to talk to the dean. We have to figure out the financial aspects. We have to determine what status you would have, whether we can accept your old MIT credits, whether you need to formally reapply as a graduate student, all those details. It might take weeks or even months. I've waited 20 years, Marcus said. I can wait a few more months. Over the next 6 weeks, Margaret watched as Dr. Harrison worked tirelessly on Marcus's behalf. He made phone calls to MIT to get Marcus's old transcripts. He met with the dean multiple times. He researched university policies and looked for creative solutions to bureaucratic obstacles. He even reached out to MIT to see if Marcus could potentially complete his doctorate there remotely, with Riverside providing support. During this time, Marcus continued his janitor work, but something had changed. Students who had been in Margaret's class that night during the power outage spread the word about the brilliant janitor. Soon Marcus found himself being greeted by name in the hallways. Students stopped to ask him questions about their math homework. Professors who had never noticed him before started conversations with him. Margaret invited Marcus to sit in on her classes, not as a janitor, but as a guest. He sat in the back row and took notes, occasionally raising his hand to ask questions that were always insightful and thought-provoking. The other students quickly accepted him as one of them. Despite the age difference and his unusual situation, Marcus's daughter Amy, who lived 3 hours away and worked as an engineer at a major tech company, came to visit when she heard the news. Margaret met her at a coffee shop near campus where Marcus had brought her to introduce them. Amy was in her 30s with her father's intelligent eyes and her mother's warm smile. She hugged her father tightly when she arrived, and Margaret could see tears in both their eyes. Professor Chen, Amy said, shaking Margaret's hand, I can't thank you enough for what you're doing for my dad. You have no idea what this means to him, to both of us. Your father is an extraordinary man, Margaret said. I'm just helping him get the recognition he deserves. Amy turned to her father. Dad, Mom would be so proud of you. You know that, right? She would be so happy that you're getting this chance. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. I wish she was here to see it, he said softly. She is, Amy said firmly. I believe that, and I know she's cheering you on. Finally, 8 weeks after that night of the power outage, Dr. Harrison called a meeting. Marcus, Margaret, and several other department members gathered in his office. I have news, Dr. Harrison announced. We've worked out an arrangement. Mr. Williams, Riverside University is prepared to offer you a position as a teaching assistant, starting next semester. You'll teach 2 sections of calculus to undergraduates. In exchange, the university will cover your tuition to complete your doctorate here in our program. We've worked with MIT, and they've agreed to transfer all your previous credits. With focused work, you could potentially complete your PhD in 3 to 4 years. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, apparently unable to believe what he was hearing. Margaret reached over and squeezed his shoulder. There are conditions, Dr. Harrison continued, holding up his hand for quiet. You'll be on probation for the first semester. You'll need to demonstrate that you can handle the teaching load and the coursework. You'll have to maintain a high standard in both areas, and you'll need to work with Dr. Chen as your initial advisor to develop your dissertation proposal. I understand, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I accept all the conditions. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Dr. Harrison said with a smile. Thank me when you finished your doctorate and are teaching full-time. That evening, Margaret organized a small celebration in her office. She invited the students who had been in class during the power outage, along with several other faculty members who had heard Marcus's story. Someone brought a cake. Someone else brought champagne. Marcus stood in the center of the room, surrounded by well-wishers looking overwhelmed and happy. David, the student who had initially asked if class was canceled that night, raised his glass. To Mr. Williams, he said loudly, who taught us that it's never too late to pursue your dreams, and that brilliance can be found in the most unexpected places. Everyone cheered and drank. Marcus wiped tears from his eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day. Jennifer approached Marcus with a shy smile. Mr. Williams, I just want to say I'm sorry again for how I acted that first night. I learned so much from you, and not just about mathematics. You taught me not to judge people by their job titles or their circumstances. You have nothing to apologize for, Marcus said kindly. Your reaction was completely natural. I'm just grateful you were open to learning from me once you got past your initial surprise. Rachel, the student who had asked about boundary conditions, handed Marcus a card that all the students from that night had signed. We wanted you to have this, she said, so you remember the night that changed everything. Marcus opened the card and read the messages inside. Many students had written about how inspired they were by his story, how they would think of him whenever they felt like giving up on their own dreams, how he had shown them what real dedication to learning looked like. I don't know what to say, Marcus said, his voice choked with emotion. You've all been so kind to me. You've made me feel like I belong here, like I'm not just the janitor anymore. You were never just the janitor, Carlos said firmly. We just didn't know it until you showed us. Margaret stood and clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. I want to say something, she announced. What happened 8 weeks ago in my classroom was extraordinary. But what's even more extraordinary is what came after. Marcus, you've shown incredible courage in being willing to take this leap. Dr. Harrison, you've shown incredible vision in making this possible. And all of you students, you've shown incredible open-mindedness in accepting Marcus as one of your own. She raised her glass higher. This whole experience has reminded me why I became a teacher. It's not just about transferring knowledge from textbooks to students' brains. It's about recognizing human potential wherever it exists. It's about creating opportunities for people to become who they were meant to be. It's about building a community where everyone can learn from everyone else, regardless of age or status or background. Here's to new beginnings, Margaret said. Here's to second chances. Here's to the power of education to transform lives. And here's to Marcus Williams, who is going to make an outstanding professor. Everyone cheered and raised their glasses. Marcus stood there, surrounded by friends and colleagues, words he hadn't been able to use in 20 years, and let himself believe that his life was truly changing. The next semester, when classes began, Marcus stood at the front of his own classroom for the first time in 2 decades. His students were freshman undergraduates taking Introduction to Calculus. They had no idea that their teaching assistant had once been a janitor. They had no idea about his incredible story. To them, he was just Mr. Williams, their TA, but Marcus knew. And every morning when he walked into that classroom, when he picked up the chalk and began to write equations on the board, when he answered students' questions and helped them understand difficult concepts, he felt a joy so profound it almost hurt. He had his life back. Not the exact life he had lost 20 years ago. That was gone forever, along with his beloved Sarah. But a new life, a second chapter, a chance to be who he was always meant to be. On his first day of teaching, Marcus arrived early. He stood alone in the empty classroom, looking at the clean blackboard, the rows of desks waiting for students, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. He thought about Sarah and how proud she would be. He thought about Amy, who had cried happy tears when he told her about his first teaching assignment. He thought about Professor Chen, who had refused to let his talent remain hidden. And he thought about that November evening 8 weeks ago, when a power outage had created a moment of darkness that somehow let his light shine through. He had spoken up when he could have remained silent. He had taken a risk when he could have stayed safe. And that single moment of courage had changed everything. As students began to file into the classroom, Marcus smiled. He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote his name on the board. Marcus Williams, teaching assistant. Then he turned to face his students and said, "Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Calculus. I'm Mr. Williams, and I'm excited to be your teacher. Let's begin."